The village of St. Mary Mead had rarely witnessed such a perfect afternoon for a garden party. The late June sunshine filtered through the ancient elm trees of Greenways Manor, casting dappled shadows across the immaculate lawn where white-clothed tables had been arranged with mathematical precision. The air carried the quintessentially English perfume of roses, fresh-cut grass, and the delicate aroma of cucumber sandwiches prepared with the thinnest possible bread and the crispest possible cucumbers. Miss Jane Marple sat at a table positioned strategically near the herbaceous border, her knitting needles clicking with the gentle rhythm that had become as familiar to the villagers as the church bells. She was working on what appeared to be a christening shawl in soft cream wool, but her mild blue eyes were far more occupied with the human drama unfolding before her than with the intricate lace pattern in her lap. Years of observing her fellow villagers had taught her that the most interesting revelations often occurred during the most ordinary social gatherings, when people's guards were lowered by the false security of familiar surroundings. Her hostess, Mrs. Dorothy Bantry, moved among her guests with the practiced grace of a woman who had been entertaining the county for 30 years. Yet Miss Marple noted a certain tension in Mrs. Bantry's shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that suggested all was not entirely well at Greenways Manor. The source of this disquiet, Miss Marple suspected, could be found in the increasingly erratic behavior of the Bantry's butler, Edmund Hartwell. Hartwell had been in service at Greenways for nearly 20 years, arriving shortly after the Great War with impeccable references and a bearing that spoke of good breeding fallen upon hard times. He was a man of perhaps 55 years, with distinguished silver hair and the sort of quiet dignity that made him seem almost more refined than his employers. His service had been exemplary, his discretion absolute, and his loyalty unquestioned, until recently. Miss Marple had first noticed the change 3 weeks earlier, during the monthly meeting of the Women's Institute held in the Greenways drawing room. Hartwell had served tea with his usual precision, but when Mrs. Price Ridley had complimented him on the excellent quality of the Earl Grey, he had looked at her with complete bewilderment, as though she had spoken in a foreign language. When Mrs. Bantry had later mentioned the incident, Hartwell had firmly denied any confusion, insisting that Mrs. Price Ridley had made no comment about tea whatsoever. Today, the butler's peculiar behavior was even more pronounced. Miss Marple watched as he approached the table where Lady Ashbrook, the recently widowed chatelaine of Ashbrook Hall, sat with her paid companion, Miss Pemberton. Lady Ashbrook was a formidable woman in her 70s, known throughout the county for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. She had been discussing the upcoming charity auction with the vicar when Hartwell appeared at her elbow with a fresh pot of tea. "Thank you, Hartwell," Lady Ashbrook said absently, then looked up at him more sharply. "Good heavens, is that really you? I thought you looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place. Edmund Hartwell, isn't it? Though that wasn't always your name, was it?" The effect of these words on the butler was extraordinary. The teapot in his hands began to tremble so violently that Miss Marple feared it would shatter against the saucer. His face, usually composed in the perfect mask of professional servility, went deathly pale, and his eyes darted around the garden as though seeking an escape route. "I beg your pardon, my lady," Hartwell managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I fear you have me confused with someone else. I have always been Edmund Hartwell." Lady Ashbrook's eyes narrowed with the predatory instinct of a woman who had spent decades ferreting out social improprieties. "Have you indeed? How curious, because I could have sworn. But perhaps I am mistaken. Old age, you know, though my memory for faces has always been quite reliable." The butler set down the teapot with hands that shook despite his obvious efforts to control them. "If you will excuse me, my lady, I must attend to the other guests." As Hartwell retreated towards the house, Miss Marple observed that his usual measured pace had become hurried, almost furtive. More interesting still was the expression that had crossed his face during the exchange with Lady Ashbrook, not the indignation of a man falsely accused, but the terror of someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. The afternoon takes a darker turn. The garden party continued its leisurely course, but Miss Marple noted an undercurrent of tension that seemed to ripple outward from the encounter between Lady Ashbrook and the butler. Mrs. Bantry appeared increasingly agitated, consulting her watch frequently and casting worried glances toward the house. The vicar, Reverend Clement, attempted to maintain the conversation about the charity auction, but his usual enthusiasm seemed forced. Even the weather appeared to conspire against the gathering's tranquility, as clouds began to gather on the horizon, promising an evening storm. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, had positioned himself near the rose garden where he could observe the proceedings while appearing to admire Mrs. Bantry's prize-winning blooms. Miss Marple had known Dr. Haydock for many years and recognized the signs that his medical instincts had been aroused. He was watching the house with the alert attention of a man who expected to be summoned professionally at any moment. The summons came sooner than even he had anticipated. At precisely 4:30, a piercing scream shattered the genteel murmur of conversation. It came from the direction of the house, high and sharp with terror. The effect on the garden party was immediate and dramatic. Conversation ceased mid-sentence. Teacups rattled against saucers, and every head turned toward Greenways Manor. Mrs. Bantry dropped the plate of Petits fours she had been carrying and ran toward the house with a speed that belied her years. Dr. Haydock was close behind her, his medical bag already in hand. The other guests followed in a confused, chattering crowd, their afternoon's entertainment transformed in an instant from social pleasantry to potential tragedy. Miss Marple, moving more slowly but with equal determination, brought up the rear of the procession. As they reached the house, she could see Mrs. Bantry's housemaid, Alice, standing in the doorway to the butler's pantry, her face white with shock and her hands pressed to her mouth. "Oh, madam," Alice gasped as Mrs. Bantry reached her. "It's Mr. Hartwell. Oh, madam, I think he's dead." The discovery in the butler's pantry. The butler's pantry at Greenways Manor was Edmund Hartwell's private domain, a small but immaculately organized room where he maintained the household silver, crystal, and other valuable items. It was here that Alice had found him, collapsed behind his desk with an overturned bottle of brandy beside him and a letter clutched in his lifeless hand. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his experienced fingers checking for signs of life that everyone already knew would not be found. Hartwell's face bore an expression of profound anguish, as though his final moments had been filled with some terrible realization or regret. "Heart failure, I should think," Dr. Haydock announced after his examination. "Though I'll need to conduct a more thorough investigation, of course. The shock of whatever upset him this afternoon may well have triggered a fatal episode." Miss Marple, who had positioned herself unobtrusively near the doorway, observed the scene with her characteristic attention to detail. She noted the pristine condition of the pantry, suggesting that Hartwell had not struggled or fought before his collapse. She saw that the brandy bottle, while overturned, had spilled very little of its contents, indicating that it had been nearly empty when it fell. Most intriguingly, she noticed that the letter in Hartwell's hand appeared to be written in his own careful script, though she could not make out the words from her position. "What could have driven him to such despair?" Mrs. Bantry whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He seemed perfectly well this morning, a bit distracted perhaps, but nothing to suggest this." Lady Ashbrook, who had followed the others into the house despite her advanced age, stood at the edge of the crowd with a peculiar expression on her face. It was not grief or shock, but something that looked remarkably like satisfaction mixed with regret. "I fear," she said quietly, "that I may have precipitated this tragedy, if I had not spoken to him as I did. But some secrets, once disturbed, refuse to remain buried." The vicar, ever eager to offer comfort, began to murmur something about the mysterious ways of Providence, but Lady Ashbrook cut him off with an imperious gesture. There was nothing mysterious about this vicar. Edmund Hartwell, if that was indeed his real name, was a man haunted by his past. I recognized him this afternoon, you see. It took me a moment to place him, but memory is a persistent thing. He was a different person 25 years ago, in a different place, with a different name and a very different reputation." The silence that followed this pronouncement was profound and deeply uncomfortable. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the curious phrase that Mrs. Bantry had mentioned earlier, Hartwell's insistence that conversations had never taken place, that incidents had never happened. Was it possible that the butler had not been suffering from confusion or illness, but from the terrible strain of maintaining a false identity for so many years? And if so, what had driven him to assume that identity in the first place? As Dr. Haydock made arrangements for the removal of the body and the other guests began to drift away in subdued clusters, Miss Marple remained in the butler's pantry, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the room where Edmund Hartwell had met his end. The letter in his hand would need to be examined, of course, and Lady Ashbrook's mysterious recognition would require further investigation. But already, Miss Marple sensed that this was no simple case of a man overcome by shame at the exposure of his past. The butler who forgot every lie, it seemed, had finally remembered the most important truth of all. And that memory, Miss Marple suspected, had cost him his life. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke as the last of the guests departed, sending sheets of rain across the gardens of Greenways Manor and washing away the last remnants of what had begun as such a perfect day for a garden party. But Miss Marple knew that some stains could not be cleansed by rain, and some secrets, once exposed to the light, cast shadows that would linger long after the storm had passed. News of Edmund Hartwell's death spread through St. Mary Mead with the characteristic velocity of village gossip, gathering embellishments and dramatic flourishes with each retelling. By the time Miss Marple made her morning rounds, the simple facts had been transformed into something resembling a sensational novel. At Fletcher's butcher shop, Mrs. Price Ridley held court beside the lamb chops, declaring that Hartwell had been discovered with a dagger protruding from his chest. "Foreign-looking thing," she insisted to her captive audience. "Mark my words, this has the hallmarks of a crime of passion. These quiet types always have the most shocking secrets." The grocers provided a different theory entirely. Old Mr. Finch, weighing out sugar with trembling hands, favored poison as the culprit. "Respectable butlers don't simply collapse," he wheezed to anyone within earshot. "There'll be something nasty in his stomach when Dr. Haydock opens him up. You mark my words." At the post office, Miss Hartnell had transformed Lady Ashbrook's vague recognition into a full confession of past crimes. She knew him from his criminal days, Miss Hartnell announced with absolute certainty. Probably a confidence trickster or worse. You can't tell me a man changes his name for innocent reasons. Miss Marple listened to these theories with her customary patience, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she made her purchases. She found the human tendency to fill gaps in knowledge with dramatic invention endlessly fascinating, though rarely helpful in determining actual truth. Each person's speculation revealed more about their own preoccupations than about poor Hartwell's fate. What struck her as genuinely significant was not the wild theories, but the underlying current of unease that ran beneath them. The villagers sensed something fundamentally wrong about the butler's death, even if they couldn't articulate what troubled them. Miss Marple shared that instinct, though her concerns centered on details the gossips had overlooked entirely. Her path led naturally to the vicarage, where she found Griselda Clement arranging flowers with unusual vigor while her husband attempted to work on his Sunday sermon. The young woman's restless energy was palpable as she thrust stems into a vase with more force than the delicate blooms required. "It's no use, Len," Griselda declared as Miss Marple was shown in. "I can't concentrate on parish matters when there's a mystery practically on our doorstep. Dr. Haydock says heart failure, but Inspector Slack arrived this morning asking the most peculiar questions. Since when does sudden death require a criminal investigation?" The Reverend Clement looked up from his papers with a weary expression. "The police must follow proper procedures, my dear. Colonel Melchett is simply being thorough." "Thoroughness doesn't explain why they're treating Mrs. Bantry's butler like a suspicious character," Griselda countered, turning to Miss Marple. "You were there when it happened. What did you make of it all?" Miss Marple accepted the offered chair and considered her words carefully. "What strikes me most is the sequence of events. Lady Ashbrook's recognition clearly distressed Mr. Hartwell enormously, but men don't typically die from embarrassment, however acute." "The shock might have triggered a weak heart," the vicar suggested. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, "though I keep thinking about that letter Dr. Haydock mentioned. A man in the throes of a fatal heart attack doesn't usually have the presence of mind to write correspondence. Yet there it was, clutched in his hand as though it contained something of vital importance." Griselda's eyes brightened with interest. "What sort of letter? A confession?" "That remains to be determined, though I suspect its contents might explain why Mr. Hartwell seemed so terrified when Lady Ashbrook spoke to him. Recognition alone shouldn't provoke such extreme fear, unless there was something truly dreadful to be recognized for." The vicar frowned thoughtfully. "You're suggesting his death wasn't simply the result of shame at exposure?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that shame rarely kills as efficiently as people imagine. Fear, on the other hand, can be quite deadly, particularly when it's justified." She rose from her chair, gathering her knitting. "I believe a visit to Lady Ashbrook might prove illuminating. If she truly recognized Mr. Hartwell from his past, she may know considerably more than she revealed yesterday." As she made her way down the vicarage path, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's conversations. The village might be busy inventing dramatic theories about foreign daggers and criminal masterminds, but the truth, she suspected, lay in quieter details that had been overlooked in the excitement. The letter, the timing, and most importantly, Lady Ashbrook's peculiar mixture of satisfaction and regret suggested a story far more complex than simple exposure and shame. Whatever Edmund Hartwell had been hiding, someone had found it worth killing for. Miss Marple approached her investigation with the methodical patience of someone who understood that truth, like a properly knitted pattern, revealed itself stitch by careful stitch. Her first call was naturally to Lady Ashbrook, whose recognition of the butler had precipitated the tragic events at Greenways Manor. Ashbrook Hall received her with its customary austere grandeur, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension in the household that had nothing to do with architectural formality. Miss Pemberton, Lady Ashbrook's nervous companion, fluttered about like a moth drawn to flame, clearly distressed by the previous day's events and the subsequent police interrogation. "The inspector was most persistent," Miss Pemberton confided, as she led Miss Marple through the morning room. "Her ladyship has been quite unsettled since yesterday. She keeps saying she should have spoken more carefully, though I'm sure she meant no harm." Lady Ashbrook herself sat rigidly upright in her chair, every inch the aristocrat despite the shadows beneath her eyes that suggested a sleepless night. Her greeting was characteristically direct. "I suppose the entire village is buzzing with speculation about what I said to that wretched man," she announced without preamble. "Inspector Slack has already extracted every detail, but I suspect you're here for more than official curiosity." Miss Marple settled into the offered chair, her knitting emerging naturally from her bag. "The village is certainly active with theories, though I find facts generally more reliable than speculation. You seemed quite certain yesterday that you recognized Mr. Hartwell." "I was certain, though the exact details have become somewhat muddled over the years." Lady Ashbrook's voice carried the frustration of someone accustomed to perfect recall. "It was approximately 25 years ago, during a season I spent taking the waters at Bath. There was a gentleman at our hotel who called himself either Edward Hamilton or Edward Hart. The memory isn't entirely clear on that point. What I do remember distinctly are those pale blue eyes with the dark ring around the iris and a small scar on his left thumb." She paused, gathering her thoughts with visible effort. This man presented himself as recently returned from India, with independent means and impeccable manners. He ingratiated himself with several wealthy widows, myself included, though fortunately my poor health kept me from paying him excessive attention. Mrs. Fortescue was less cautious. He proposed marriage, she accepted, and 3 days before the ceremony, he vanished along with her jewelry and a considerable sum from her bank account. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. "And you're certain this was the same man serving as the Bantry's butler?" "Absolutely. The face was older, the hair grayer, but those distinctive features were unmistakable. When I saw him yesterday, pouring tea as if nothing had happened, I felt compelled to speak." "Did you share your suspicions with anyone else before confronting him?" Miss Pemberton, who had been hovering anxiously near the window, suddenly interjected. "Oh, yes, my lady mentioned it to Dr. Haydock when we were admiring the roses, and to me, of course, though I didn't think much of it at the time." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Dr. Haydock knew of your suspicions before you spoke to Mr. Hartwell?" "I believe so," Lady Ashbrook confirmed. "I remarked on the resemblance while we were discussing the garden plantings." Miss Pemberton twisted her hands nervously. "There's something else, Miss Marple. After her ladyship spoke to Hartwell, he didn't go directly to the house as everyone assumed. I was watching from the terrace, and I saw him stop to speak with Dr. Haydock near the rose arbor. They had quite an intense conversation before he finally went inside." This revelation struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant. Dr. Haydock, who had been so conveniently positioned to respond when the scream came. Dr. Haydock, who had pronounced heart failure with such certainty. Her next stop was inevitably Greenway's Manor, where she found Inspector Slack in full investigative mode, his voice booming through the morning room as he questioned the household staff. The inspector's theory had crystallized overnight into a neat narrative of guilt and suicide. "Digitalis," he announced to Mrs. Bantry with obvious satisfaction. "Found traces in the brandy glass. Foxglove extract, easily obtained from any garden. The man was cornered, knew his past was catching up with him, and took the coward's way out." Mrs. Bantry looked haggard, clutching a lace handkerchief as though it were a lifeline. "But Jane, the letter they found in his hand, it wasn't a farewell note at all. It was the strangest thing, just a list of items and dates. The Blue Room, 1924. The silver tureen. The woman in the red hat." Inspector Slack thinks it was the rambling of a guilty conscience, but it makes no sense as a confession. Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Perhaps it wasn't meant as a confession. You mentioned he had been forgetful lately." "Terribly so. He forgot to lock the silver pantry, called me by the wrong name, seemed confused about conversations that had just taken place. I thought he might be drinking, but now I wonder if something else was affecting his memory." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said quietly, "he wasn't forgetting lies. Perhaps he was losing the ability to remember truths, and was desperately trying to record them before they slipped away entirely." As she left Greenway's, Miss Marple's mind worked furiously. The police narrative was tidy, but wrong. A man terrified of exposure might flee, but he wouldn't sit down to methodically list furniture and dates before poisoning himself, unless the poisoning wasn't his idea at all. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Dr. Haydock's prior knowledge of Lady Ashbrook's suspicions, his private conversation with Hartwell, and his convenient presence at the death scene created a troubling constellation of coincidences. Add to that his medical knowledge of digitalis and its effects, and Miss Marple found herself contemplating a far darker possibility than suicide. Edmund Hartwell, whatever his true name and past crimes, had been silenced, and the person who silenced him possessed both the means and the opportunity to make murder look like the desperate act of a cornered criminal. The morning after Edmund Hartwell's death brought Inspector Slack to Greenway's Manor with the satisfied air of a man who had solved a case before breakfast. His theory was elegantly simple. A confidence trickster exposed by Lady Ashbrook had taken his own life, rather than face the consequences of his criminal past. The digitalis found in the brandy glass, the mysterious letter, and the butler's obvious distress all supported this neat conclusion. Miss Marple, however, found herself troubled by the very neatness of the solution. She had observed human nature for too many years to believe that people, even desperate ones, behaved with such convenient simplicity. Her doubts were reinforced when Colonel Melchett arrived from county headquarters, bringing with him the thoroughness that Inspector Slack often lacked. The official investigation deepens. Colonel Melchett established his temporary command post at the vicarage, where Miss Marple found herself invited to review the preliminary findings. The post-mortem had confirmed digitalis poisoning as the cause of death, but several details troubled the chief constable. "The timing bothers me," he confided to Miss Marple as they examined the evidence. "Lady Ashbrook spoke to Hartwell at 4 o'clock. He was found dead at 4:30. Digitalis typically takes several hours to prove fatal, yet he died within minutes of consuming what appears to be a substantial dose." Miss Marple studied the letter found clutched in Hartwell's hand, her experienced eyes noting the careful handwriting and methodical organization. February 1924. The man with the walking stick. The blue room. Locked door. Broken vase. Silver tureen. Misplaced. Later found. The woman in the red hat. Said she knew me from somewhere. The entries read less like a confession than like a desperate attempt to preserve fading memories. "It reminds me of old Mr. Pettinger," she observed gently. "When his memory began to fail, he wrote himself notes about everyday things. This feels similar, not the ravings of guilt, but the careful documentation of someone who fears losing important information." Colonel Melchett nodded thoughtfully. "There's another curious detail. We've discovered that Hartwell recently attempted to secure a life insurance policy with Mrs. Bantry as beneficiary. The company declined due to incomplete medical records and his age, but it suggests he was planning for the future, not contemplating suicide." Medical mysteries and contradictions. Miss Marple's next step was naturally to consult Dr. Haydock, whose medical expertise might shed light on the contradictory evidence. She found him in his surgery, but his usual jovial manner seemed strained, replaced by something more guarded. "The village is full of wild theories about poor Hartwell," she began diplomatically. "I was hoping you might help clarify the medical aspects." Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The facts are straightforward. Digitalis poisoning causes heart failure. Given his age and the stress of exposure, it wouldn't have required a massive dose." "But the timing troubles me," Miss Marple persisted. "Miss Pemberton mentioned seeing you speak with Mr. Hartwell after Lady Ashbrook's confrontation. What was his state of mind?" The doctor's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple's trained eye caught it. "He was agitated, asked for something to calm his nerves. I suggested a small brandy and advised him to see a specialist in London about his recent memory problems." "Memory problems?" "Considerable ones. He'd been coming to me in confidence for weeks, terrified he was losing his mind. Confusion, repetitive questions, insisting conversations had never occurred. I suspected early dementia, but he refused to seek proper diagnosis, claiming too many people in London might recognize him." Miss Marple absorbed this information carefully. A man losing his memory would indeed be vulnerable, but it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of his death. "Dr. Haydock, could digitalis poisoning cause such memory symptoms if administered in small doses over time?" The doctor's face went very still. "Theoretically, yes. Chronic digitalis toxicity can present with neurological symptoms before the fatal cardiac event, but that would suggest murder," Miss Marple finished quietly. "Gradual poisoning to compromise his faculties, followed by a final fatal dose when subtlety was no longer sufficient." Revelations from the past. Determined to understand the full scope of Hartwell's secrets, Miss Marple made her way to the village library. The efficient Miss Lemon quickly located the archived newspapers from Bath, and Miss Marple spent the morning scrolling through 25-year-old headlines. She found the initial report easily enough. Edward Hamilton, confidence trickster, suspected of defrauding several wealthy women before vanishing with Mrs. Fortescue's jewelry. But it was the follow-up article that made her catch her breath. 2 weeks after Hamilton's disappearance, a body matching his description had been pulled from the River Avon. Though decomposition prevented positive identification, the authorities had largely closed the case, assuming the criminal had met his end in the river. If Edmund Hartwell was indeed Edward Hamilton, he hadn't merely changed his name. He had risen from the dead. Such knowledge would be extraordinarily valuable to the right person, but also extraordinarily dangerous to possess. A new theory emerges. Walking home through the village, Miss Marple found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the case. Hartwell's mysterious list suddenly took on new significance. The Blue Room, 1924, and the Silver Tureen weren't random memories but specific references to events at Greenways Manor during his early employment there. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned that a valuable silver tureen had gone missing during their initial move to Greenways in 1924, around the time Hartwell had begun his service. What if the butler hadn't been the victim of blackmail, but its perpetrator? What if his 20 years of faithful service had been funded not by wages alone, but by his knowledge of secrets worth keeping quiet? The gradual memory loss, whether natural or induced, would have made such an arrangement increasingly precarious. A blackmailer who couldn't remember his own schemes was a liability to everyone involved, and when Lady Ashbrook's recognition threatened to expose his true identity, someone had decided that Edmund Hartwell knew too much to live. The shifting landscape of suspicion. As Miss Marple reached her cottage, she realized that the case had transformed entirely. What had appeared to be a simple suicide by a man with a guilty past was revealing itself as something far more complex. Hartwell hadn't died because his secrets were exposed. He had died because he was losing the ability to keep other people's secrets safe. The question now was not who had recognized Edmund Hartwell, but who had been paying him to forget what Edward Hamilton had learned. In a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, the most dangerous person was often the one who knew it best. And in Greenways Manor, that person had been the butler, who was slowly forgetting every lie he'd been paid to maintain. Dr. Haydock's convenient presence at the death scene, his private conversation with Hartwell, and his detailed knowledge of digitalis effects suddenly seemed less like professional competence and more like careful preparation. But Miss Marple knew that in mysteries, as in knitting, the most obvious pattern was not always the correct one. The true killer might be someone she hadn't yet considered, someone whose secrets were worth more than a butler's life. The investigation was far from over, and Miss Marple suspected that the most shocking revelations were yet to come. The morning after her visit to Lady Ashbrook brought Miss Marple an unexpected caller. Mrs. Bantry arrived at her cottage before breakfast, clutching a small leather-bound notebook and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something both fascinating and deeply disturbing. "Jane, I couldn't sleep after our conversation yesterday," Mrs. Bantry announced, settling into the offered chair with visible agitation. "I kept thinking about what you said regarding Hartwell's methodical nature, so I searched his quarters more thoroughly than the police had done. This was hidden behind a loose board in his wardrobe, wrapped in oiled cloth, as though he feared it might be discovered." Miss Marple accepted the notebook with the reverence due to what she immediately recognized as crucial evidence. The leather binding was worn smooth by years of handling, and the pages within contained entry after entry in Hartwell's careful script. But what struck her most forcefully was how the handwriting deteriorated as the entries progressed, from precise, confident strokes in the early pages to increasingly shaky, confused scrawl in the recent months. The Chronicle of Secrets revealed, March 15, 1924, the Blue Room visitor arrived after midnight. Side door left unlocked as arranged. Payment received in cash, $50. The entry was followed by others equally cryptic, but methodical. April 3rd. Silver tureen returned quietly to pantry. Colonel Bantry's instructions followed precisely. September 12th. Overheard library conversation. The arrangement must continue, were the exact words used. Miss Marple studied each entry with growing comprehension. This isn't a diary, Dolly. It's an insurance policy. Hartwell was documenting everything he witnessed, every secret transaction, every compromising incident. A man with such a questionable past would naturally seek protection against future threats. But the most disturbing entries were the recent ones. The medicine tastes bitter today. Doctor says it's necessary for the memory troubles, but I feel worse afterward. Confused, forgetful. Sometimes I cannot remember conversations from the same morning. The final entries were barely legible, desperate attempts to record information before it slipped away entirely. Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Melchett, whose grim expression suggested significant developments. "We've completed the full toxicological analysis," he announced without preamble. The brandy glass contained more than digitalis. There were substantial traces of scopolamine, a powerful sedative that causes confusion, memory loss, and, most importantly, compliance in the victim. Miss Marple's needles paused in their steady rhythm. "Twilight sleep," she murmured. "Used in medical procedures to make patients forget pain and trauma, but in sustained doses, it would gradually destroy a person's ability to form coherent memories." Exactly. Someone was systematically drugging Hartwell for weeks, possibly months, before administering the fatal dose of digitalis. The scopolamine explains his recent confusion and memory lapses. He wasn't developing natural dementia. He was being deliberately incapacitated. The pattern emerges. Mrs. Bantry's face had gone pale as the implications became clear. "You're saying someone was slowly poisoning Edmund to make him forget things, then killed him when that wasn't sufficient?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mr. Hartwell's value lay not in what he knew, but in his ability to forget selectively. A blackmailer who loses his memory becomes useless, but a keeper of secrets who can no longer keep them becomes dangerous to everyone whose confidences he holds." Colonel Melchett consulted his notes. "There's more. We've traced the source of both drugs. The digitalis came from Dr. Haydock's dispensary, and scopolamine is used in his obstetric practice. But before you assume the obvious, consider this. Both substances were reported stolen from his surgery 3 weeks ago, a break-in that Dr. Haydock reported to the police, though nothing else was taken." Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest rather than surprise. "How convenient for someone to steal exactly the substances needed for this particular murder. It suggests either remarkable foresight or intimate knowledge of what would be required." Her contemplation was interrupted by Mrs. Bantry's sharp intake of breath. "Jane, look at this entry from last month. The woman in the red hat knows more than she admits. She watches everything, remembers everything. Must be careful what I say in her presence." "The woman in the red hat," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "At yesterday's garden party, only one person wore such distinctive headwear. Miss Pemberton, Lady Ashbrook's companion, with those artificial cherries adorning her hat." Revelations and connections. Colonel Melchett's expression sharpened with interest. "We've been investigating Miss Pemberton's background. She's been with Lady Ashbrook for 16 years, arriving with impeccable references from a family in Yorkshire. But when we contacted that family, they had no record of employing anyone by that name." Miss Marple's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her knitting. 16 years would place her arrival around 1909, well after the Bath incident, but not so long as to arouse suspicion. Long enough for scandal to fade, for a woman to reinvent herself completely. "There's something else," Mrs. Bantry added, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about that entry regarding the Blue Room in 1924. That was when we had extensive renovations, and several people stayed with us. Lady Ashbrook was one of them. But she wasn't Lady Ashbrook then. She was Mrs. Arthur Bantry, recently married to my husband's cousin. Arthur had suffered some financial difficulties and was staying with us while he recovered his fortune." The pieces were beginning to form a clearer picture. though Miss Marple sensed that the complete pattern remained hidden. And did Mr. Arthur Bantry recover his fortune? Dramatically so. Within 6 months, he had made a killing in South African diamond investments. He attributed it to insider information from a business contact, but Arthur was always secretive about his methods. Miss Marple considered this carefully. If Hartwell had witnessed something in the Blue Room in 1924, a clandestine meeting, a suspicious transaction, or perhaps the arrival of stolen goods, that knowledge could have provided him with leverage over the future Lady Ashbrook for decades. But leverage was a two-edged sword, particularly when the person holding it began to lose the mental capacity to wield it effectively. The hidden visitor. "There's one more detail that troubles me," Miss Marple said, consulting the notebook again. "This entry from yesterday morning. Registered letter arrived. Contents disturbing. The past refuses to stay buried." And then, later, "Unexpected visitor via garden path. Old arrangements discussed. Payment terms have changed." Colonel Melchett frowned. "We have no record of any visitor to Greenways yesterday apart from the official garden party guests." "Because," Miss Marple observed, "some visitors prefer not to be recorded. Someone came to see Hartwell privately, possibly to discuss the contents of that registered letter. Someone who knew about the side entrance near the butler's pantry and could move through the grounds unobserved." She paused, her mind working rapidly through the implications. "I believe we need to examine this case from an entirely different angle. We've been assuming that Hartwell died because his past was exposed. But what if he died because he was about to expose someone else's past? What if that registered letter contained information that threatened not him, but another person entirely?" The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across Miss Marple's garden, but she felt as though she were finally beginning to see clearly through the carefully constructed web of deception that surrounded Edmund Hartwell's death. The butler who forgot every lie had been silenced not for his own crimes, but for his knowledge of crimes committed by others, crimes that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. The investigation was far from over, but Miss Marple now understood that they were not dealing with a simple case of exposure and suicide. They were confronting a carefully planned murder designed to look like the desperate act of a guilty man, when in reality it was the calculated elimination of an inconvenient witness whose failing memory had made him more dangerous than his perfect recall ever had. Miss Marple's investigation began with the registered letter that had so disturbed Hartwell on the morning of his death. A visit to the post office revealed that Miss Hartnell, despite her reputation for dramatic embellishment, possessed an excellent memory for postal details when properly consulted. "A registered letter for Greenways yesterday morning," Miss Hartnell confirmed with obvious satisfaction at being consulted on official business. "Arrived on the 10 o'clock delivery, signed for by Hartwell himself at 10:15. Bath postmark, masculine handwriting, rather old-fashioned. The sender was A.J. Harding. I made particular note, because Hartwell looked quite shaken when he saw the name." Bath again. Miss Marple thanked her and proceeded to Greenways, where the atmosphere remained strained, despite the police having concluded their initial examination. Mrs. Bantry, eager to be helpful, arranged for Miss Marple to speak privately with the household staff in the servants' hall. Witness accounts and timeline discrepancies. Alice, the housemaid who had discovered the body, proved to be an observant witness when encouraged to speak freely. "The postman had me sign the book, but Mr. Hartwell came out straight away and took the letter. He looked at the writing and went white as fresh linen, said nobody was to disturb him for half an hour, and went straight to his room." Young Kitty, the second housemaid, added a crucial detail that the police had overlooked. "Only Dr. Haydock disturbed him, miss. Came through the side door from the garden about 11 o'clock. I told him Mr. Hartwell didn't want visitors, but the doctor said illness didn't keep convenient hours, and went along the passage anyway." This information aligned troublingly well with Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the systematic poisoning, but it was Alice's next revelation that proved most significant. There was someone else too, miss, though I didn't mention it to Inspector Slack because I wasn't entirely certain. Around noon, I was polishing silver by the scullery window and saw a figure slip along the yew hedge, not from the front gate, but round the side, as if they'd come across the fields. Looked like a lady in a light coat and red hat. When the proper guests arrived later, they all came through the front drive. Miss Pemberton's Hidden Truth. Armed with this information, Miss Marple made her way to Ashbrook Hall, where she found Miss Pemberton alone in the morning room, Lady Ashbrook having taken to her bed, with what the companion described as nervous exhaustion. The woman seemed diminished, her usual fluttering anxiety replaced by hollow-eyed wariness. Miss Pemberton, Miss Marple began gently, I believe it's time we discussed your true identity. The police have discovered that your references from Yorkshire cannot be verified because the family you claim to serve never existed. The companion's hand stilled over her embroidery, and for a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. My real name is Sarah Pemberton. My father was Gerald Pemberton of Pemberton and Associates, a firm of solicitors in London that specialized in estate settlements. 25 years ago, a client came to us, a wealthy widow named Mrs. Fortescue, who had discovered her fiancé was a confidence trickster. The man had already swindled several women and disappeared with substantial sums. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. This trickster, he went by the name Edward Hamilton. Yes, but there was more to the story than anyone knew. You see, before he targeted Mrs. Fortescue, Edward Hamilton had courted me. I was young, foolish, and completely taken in by his charm. When he proposed, I gave him access to my inheritance, money my mother had left me. He took everything and vanished, leaving me with nothing but shame and debt. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. Your father tried to help Mrs. Fortescue recover her losses? He spent everything attempting to track Hamilton down, to prove that the missing funds from client accounts had gone to pursuing the criminal, not to line his own pockets. When Hamilton's body was supposedly found in the river, the case was closed, but my father's reputation was destroyed. He took his own life shortly after, and I was left with nothing. Dr. Haydock's confession. Miss Marple's next visit was to Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she found the physician looking considerably older than he had just days before. Her direct approach yielded immediate results. You know why I'm here, doctor. The police know about the stolen drugs, your presence near the pantry door, and the scopolamine in Hartwell's system. Dr. Haydock removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes wearily. I didn't kill him, Jane, but I did administer the scopolamine. He begged me for it, said memories were surfacing that he couldn't control, terrible memories about people he'd hurt. He believed that if he could suppress them, he could continue his life here peacefully. His distress was so acute that I finally agreed to small, monitored doses. And the digitalis that killed him? Stolen from my surgery, as I reported, but not by Hartwell. Someone else discovered our arrangement and used it for their own ends. Someone who realized that a confused, drugged butler would make the perfect scapegoat for murder. A new complication. Miss Marple's investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Melchett with disturbing news. There's been a burglary at Ashbrook Hall. The wall safe in Lady Ashbrook's boudoir has been opened, and certain papers are missing. Nothing else was taken. Jewelry, silver, all untouched. Only documents. This development cast the entire case in a new light. Miss Marple realized that Hartwell's death was not simply about revenge for past crimes, but about protecting present secrets. The systematic poisoning, the careful timing, and now the selective burglary suggested a methodical mind at work, someone who understood that the butler's failing memory made him both vulnerable and dangerous. The emerging pattern. As Miss Marple walked home through the village, she found herself contemplating the complex web of connections spanning 25 years. Edward Hamilton's transformation into Edmund Hartwell had brought him into contact with people from his past. Lady Ashbrook, who had recognized him, and Sarah Pemberton, who had lived under his nose for 16 years while harboring her own secrets. But the murder itself was not a crime of passion driven by old grievances. It was a carefully calculated elimination of someone who knew too much about present-day secrets at Greenways Manor. The Blue Room incidents, the silver tureen, the mysterious visitors, all documented in Hartwell's notebook, and all potentially damaging to someone who had been paying for his silence. Someone had used the chaos of Hamilton's exposed past to hide a very modern murder. The question now was not who had recognized Edmund Hartwell, but who had been most threatened by what he remembered and what they were willing to do to ensure those memories died with him. The investigation was entering its most dangerous phase, where the killer might decide that one death was not enough to protect their secrets. Miss Marple sensed that the truth lay not in the distant crimes of Bath, but in the immediate vicinity of Greenways Manor, where someone had been living with a secret so terrible that murder seemed preferable to exposure. The burglary at Ashbrook Hall transformed the atmosphere of St. Mary Mead from curious speculation to genuine unease. Miss Marple observed how conversations ceased abruptly when footsteps approached, and how even the most inveterate gossips cast nervous glances over their shoulders. The killer, she reflected, had made a crucial error in returning to steal documents. Murder might silence one witness, but it inevitably created new evidence to be discovered. The documentary trail Colonel Melchett's morning visit brought both recovered evidence and disturbing revelations. "Found these scattered in the hedge behind Ashbrook Hall," he announced, spreading water-stained papers across Miss Marple's tea table. "Whoever broke in took what they needed and discarded the rest rather carelessly." The documents painted a picture of financial desperation and questionable arrangements spanning decades. Letters from the late Lord Ashbrook to Arthur Bantry revealed mounting debts and references to the arrangement with your man and distasteful but necessary measures involving the diamonds. Most significantly, a draft partnership agreement named Gerald Pemberton, Sarah Pemberton's father, as legal intermediary for transactions between the two estates. Mrs. Bantry's subsequent discovery in her own attic provided the missing pieces. Hidden behind old trunks were Arthur Bantry's personal records from 1924, documenting substantial money transfers through shell companies and offshore accounts. "Arthur stayed with us during the renovations," Mrs. Bantry explained, her voice trembling. "We thought he was recovering from financial difficulties, but these papers suggest he was orchestrating something far more complex." Miss Marple studied the dates carefully. Every transaction coincided precisely with Hartwell's Blue Room entries, confirming that the butler had witnessed systematic financial manipulations that were, at minimum, ethically questionable, and quite possibly criminally fraudulent. Lady Ashbrook's confession. Their examination was interrupted by urgent news from Ashbrook Hall. Lady Ashbrook, suffering what appeared to be nervous collapse, had requested Miss Marple's immediate presence. The formidable aristocrat received her in the library, her usual commanding presence diminished by obvious distress. "I've been protecting secrets that should have remained buried," Lady Ashbrook announced without preamble. "The stolen documents contained evidence of my participation in Arthur Bantry's schemes. We were more than cousins by marriage. We were business partners and, I must admit, lovers. My first husband was considerably older, and Arthur was charming and ambitious, though utterly without scruples." She detailed how her substantial capital had funded Arthur's investment schemes in exchange for generous returns. Those profits supported my comfortable widowhood and eventual marriage to Lord Ashbrook. Edmund Hartwell witnessed everything: the late-night meetings, the document transfers, the arrival of Arthur's associates through the side entrance. I compensated him handsomely for his discretion over the years. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily, until his memory began to fail, making his discretion unreliable. "Precisely. But I swear to you, Miss Marple, I didn't harm him. Despite everything, Edmund was loyal in his fashion." The second victim, Lady Ashbrook's protestations, were interrupted by Colonel Melchett's urgent arrival. There's been another incident. Miss Pemberton was found unconscious in the church vestry, apparently poisoned with the same substances used on Hartwell. Miss Marple examined the crime scene with characteristic attention to detail. Miss Pemberton lay pale and still, her breathing shallow, while beside her, an empty digitalis vial suggested another suicide attempt. However, Miss Marple noted crucial contradictory evidence: the victim's scattered handbag contents, missing gloves, and a distinct bruise on her wrist. Suicides rarely search their own belongings or bruise themselves before taking poison, Inspector Slack, Miss Marple observed quietly. This was clearly an attempted murder staged to look like guilt-driven self-destruction. The crucial clue. While Miss Pemberton was transported to hospital, Reverend Clement approached Miss Marple in the churchyard. "I found this near the vestry door," he said, producing a distinctive silver button wrapped in his handkerchief. The button bore an intricate crest that Miss Marple recognized immediately. She had seen it recently on someone's waistcoat, someone whose presence at both crime scenes had seemed perfectly natural. The pieces suddenly aligned with startling clarity. Hartwell's registered letter hadn't come from a creditor or past victim, but from a private investigator the butler had hired to verify his growing suspicions about a current village resident. The systematic scopolamine poisoning hadn't been designed to make Hartwell forget his own past, but to prevent him from remembering crucial details about someone else's false identity. Miss Pemberton's attack confirmed Miss Marple's theory. The companion had been silenced, not for attempting blackmail, but because her years of quiet observation had led her to the same dangerous conclusion as Hartwell. The man who had destroyed her father's reputation 25 years ago hadn't died in the Bath River. He had reinvented himself completely, using stolen funds to build a new life of respectability and influence in St. Mary Mead. The hidden truth. As evening approached and storm clouds gathered over the village, Miss Marple understood the full scope of the deception. Edward Hamilton's supposed death had been staged, allowing him to assume a new identity while Arthur Bantry became the public face of their financial schemes. When Bantry died in South Africa, the real architect had remained safely hidden, protected by Hartwell's paid discretion and his own carefully constructed reputation. But Hartwell's failing memory had threatened everything. The butler's desperate attempts to record fading recollections might have exposed connections that someone had spent decades concealing. The solution had been ruthlessly efficient: eliminate the witness and stage it as suicide by a guilty man. Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, knowing that tomorrow would bring the confrontation she had been preparing for. The killer believed both threats neutralized, but had underestimated the observational powers of an elderly spinster with a knitting bag and a lifetime of studying human nature. The butler who forgot every lie had died protecting secrets that were never his own, and Miss Marple was determined that his death would not be in vain. The morning brought Miss Marple an unusual sense of urgency. The pattern was complete in her mind. But patterns meant nothing without proof, and proof required the most delicate of psychological maneuvers. She had learned over the years that the guilty, when properly approached, would often convict themselves through their very attempts to appear innocent. The careful orchestration. Miss Marple's first step was to arrange what appeared to be a casual tea party at her cottage, ostensibly to clear up some lingering questions about poor Edmund Hartwell's tragic end. She invited Dr. Haydock, explaining that his medical expertise might help resolve certain inconsistencies that troubled her. Colonel Melchett was asked to attend in his official capacity, though she assured him it was merely to satisfy an old woman's curiosity. The third invitation went to Lady Ashbrook, with the suggestion that her recognition of Hartwell might prove more significant than anyone had realized. Miss Marple also requested that Miss Pemberton, despite her recent ordeal, join them if her health permitted, as her observations during 16 years of service might provide crucial insights. As her guests assembled in the small sitting room, Miss Marple noted the subtle tensions that immediately manifested. Dr. Haydock appeared unusually pale. his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more guarded. Lady Ashbrook sat rigidly upright, while Miss Pemberton, though still weak from her poisoning, watched everyone with sharp, calculating eyes. The gentle interrogation. Miss Marple began with her characteristic indirection, discussing the various theories that had circulated through the village. "Everyone has focused so intently on Edmund Hartwell's past as Edward Hamilton," she observed, pouring tea with steady hands. "But I've been wondering if we haven't been looking at this entirely backwards." She produced Hartwell's notebook, open to one of the more legible entries. "This particular notation has puzzled me greatly. The doctor's hands shake when he thinks no one is watching. Same tremor as the man in Bath who counted Mrs. Fortescue's jewelry. Such an odd thing for a butler to record, don't you think?" Dr. Haydock's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. The poor man's mind was clearly deteriorating. Random observations, meaningless connections. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I've found that people losing their memory often become more observant about details in the present, as if compensating for their inability to recall the past clearly. And Hartwell had such excellent reasons to be observant about anyone connected to the Bath affair." She turned to Lady Ashbrook with apparent casualness. "You mentioned recognizing Hartwell as Edward Hamilton, but memory can play such tricks after 25 years. I've been wondering if you might have confused him with someone else from that time, perhaps Hamilton's partner, the man who provided the medical expertise and social connections that made their scheme so successful." The crucial revelation. Miss Pemberton spoke for the first time, her voice weak but determined. "I knew there was something familiar about Dr. Haydock when I first arrived at Lady Ashbrook's service 16 years ago. It took me years to place it, but eventually I remembered. He was the young medical student who had examined my father's health when the stress of the Hamilton case began affecting him." Arthur Bantry was his name then, before he completed his medical training and became Dr. Haydock. The silence that followed was profound and deeply uncomfortable. Dr. Haydock had gone very still, his professional mask beginning to slip. Miss Marple continued as though nothing unusual had been said. "It would have been such a clever scheme, really. Arthur Bantry, the medical student with social connections, partners with the charming Edward Hamilton. When their activities are exposed, Hamilton takes all the blame and supposedly drowns, while Bantry completes his medical degree under a new name and establishes himself as a respectable country doctor." She produced the silver button found near the church vestry. "This bears a distinctive medical college crest, not from your official alma mater, Dr. Haydock, but from the school where Arthur Bantry studied before his disappearance. I had it verified through their alumni records. Rather careless to wear such an identifiable piece when attempting murder, but then you've grown comfortable with your false identity over the years." The medical evidence Colonel Melchett leaned forward with growing interest. "Are you suggesting that Dr. Haydock is actually this Arthur Bantry character?" "I'm suggesting that the real Edmund Hartwell was never Edward Hamilton, at all, but simply a man hired to impersonate him, first to provide Hamilton with an alibi, later to serve as a convenient scapegoat if the past ever caught up with them. Dr. Haydock needed someone close by who knew his true identity, someone he could control through a combination of payment and subtle medical manipulation." Miss Marple's voice grew gentler but more inexorable. "The scopolamine wasn't administered at Hartwell's request, was it, Doctor? You've been gradually poisoning him for months, making him confused and compliant, ensuring he couldn't reveal what he knew about your true identity. But when his condition worsened and he began writing things down, you realized that a confused witness was more dangerous than a clear-headed one." Dr. Haydock's composure finally cracked entirely. "You can't prove any of this. It's speculation based on circumstantial evidence." The final evidence. Miss Pemberton reached into her handbag with trembling fingers and produced a small leather portfolio. "I've spent 16 years gathering proof, Doctor. Letters in Arthur Bantry's handwriting, medical records showing the treatments you gave my father, photographs from Bath that show you clearly in Hamilton's company. I was going to present it all to the police when you lured me to the church vestry." She opened the portfolio to reveal documents that made Dr. Haydock's face go ashen. "You killed my father as surely as if you'd poisoned him directly. The shame and stress of being blamed for Hamilton's crimes destroyed his health and drove him to suicide. I've waited 25 years for justice." Colonel Melchett rose from his chair, his hand moving toward his pocket. "Dr. Haydock, or should I say, Mr. Bantry, I believe you should accompany me to the station. There are several charges to be discussed." The confession. Dr. Haydock looked around the room at the faces watching him with varying expressions of horror, betrayal, and grim satisfaction. The weight of 25 years of deception seemed to settle on his shoulders all at once. "Hamilton was getting careless," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "The Fortescue business was supposed to be our last job, but he was becoming reckless, talking too much. I had to protect myself. Hiring Hartwell to impersonate him was brilliant. It gave Hamilton an alibi while I arranged his death in the river." He laughed bitterly. "I thought I'd covered everything perfectly. New identity, respectable profession, even a war record to explain any gaps in my history. But Hartwell knew too much, and when his memory started failing naturally, he became unpredictable. The scopolamine was meant to keep him manageable, but he started writing things down, hiring investigators." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "And Miss Pemberton had recognized you, despite your careful transformation. 2 witnesses to your past were too many, as Colonel Melchett placed the handcuffs on the man who had been Arthur Bantry, Edward Hamilton's partner, and finally, Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple reflected on the terrible irony of the case. The butler who forgot every lie had died not for his own deceptions, but for his knowledge of someone else's carefully constructed false life." The afternoon sun slanted through her cottage windows, casting long shadows across the room, where 25 years of secrets had finally been brought into the light. Justice, Miss Marple thought, was often delayed, but it had a persistence that rivaled her own knitting, stitch by stitch, pattern by pattern, until the whole design was revealed at last. The formal revelation of Dr. Haydock's crimes required the measured ceremony that such momentous discoveries demanded. Miss Marple found herself once again at Greenways Manor, this time in the drawing room, where Colonel Melchett had assembled all the principal figures in the tragedy. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and dread, as though the very walls of the house had absorbed the weight of 25 years of deception finally coming to light. The official gathering, Inspector Slack, sat rigidly in his chair, his notebook open, but his expression skeptical despite the mounting evidence against Dr. Haydock. Mrs. Bantry occupied her usual place by the fireplace, though her customary composure had been replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered. Lady Ashbrook, pale but determined, sat beside Miss Pemberton, who, despite her recent ordeal, had insisted on attending this final revelation. "Inspector Slack has requested that we review the complete case systematically," Colonel Melchett announced, "to ensure that every detail is properly documented for the prosecution. Miss Marple, if you would be so kind as to explain your reasoning from the beginning." Miss Marple arranged her knitting with characteristic precision before beginning. "The fundamental error everyone made, myself included initially, was assuming that Edmund Hartwell died because his past as Edward Hamilton had been exposed. In reality, he died because someone else's past was about to be revealed, and that someone possessed both the medical knowledge and the ruthless determination to silence him permanently." She paused, allowing the weight of this statement to settle over the room. The systematic administration of scopolamine over several months was not the desperate act of a man trying to forget his own crimes, but the calculated manipulation of a witness whose memory had become inconveniently unreliable. The medical evidence unveiled. Dr. Lloyd, the London specialist who had examined the toxicological evidence, provided the clinical details that supported Miss Marple's theory. The scopolamine levels in Mr. Hartwell's system indicate regular administration over approximately 4 months. The doses were carefully calibrated to cause memory impairment and confusion without producing obvious physical symptoms that might arouse suspicion. He consulted his notes with professional precision. Combined with the natural aging process, this created the perfect illusion of early dementia. When the final digitalis dose was administered, it appeared entirely consistent with a confused man's desperate suicide attempt. The medical expertise required for such a scheme points unmistakably to someone with advanced pharmaceutical knowledge. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Dr. Haydock's position as the village physician provided him with both the means and the opportunity to carry out this gradual poisoning. More importantly, it gave him the perfect cover. Who would suspect the very doctor treating Hartwell's condition of being its cause? Miss Pemberton's patient investigation. The revelation of Miss Pemberton's true identity and 16-year investigation provided the most shocking element of the case. Sarah Pemberton, no longer the nervous, fluttering companion, but a woman transformed by the vindication of her patient quest for justice, addressed the room with quiet dignity. "My father, Gerald Pemberton, was destroyed by the Hamilton affair through no fault of his own," she began, her voice steady, despite the emotional weight of her words. "When Arthur Bantry and Edward Hamilton's scheme collapsed, my father was blamed for the missing client funds that had actually been used to finance their criminal activities. The shame and stress killed him, as surely as if they had administered poison directly." She produced the leather portfolio that had nearly cost her life. "I spent 16 years gathering proof of Arthur Bantry's survival and transformation into Dr. Haydock. Handwriting samples, medical records, photographs from Bath, all carefully collected while I maintained my role as Lady Ashbrook's unobtrusive companion." Miss Marple observed the profound irony of the situation. "So when you visited Hartwell through the garden path on the day he died, you were attempting to warn him, not threaten him. You showed him evidence that he was being systematically poisoned and urged him to seek police protection." "But he was too confused by then," Miss Pemberton replied sadly. "The scopolamine had so damaged his ability to distinguish between genuine memories and drug-induced hallucinations that he couldn't process what I was telling him. I left him desperately trying to write down what I'd revealed before the memories dissolved again." The psychological profile of a killer Colonel Melchett's investigation had uncovered the meticulous planning behind both murders. Dr. Haydock staged the break-in at his own surgery to create the impression that an unknown party was stealing his medical supplies. He needed everyone to believe that some external threat was using his drugs for murder, while he remained the innocent physician caught in a web of historical crimes. The plan revealed a mind of chilling calculation: eliminate both witnesses to his true identity, stage their deaths as suicide and attempted suicide by guilt-ridden conspirators, and emerge as the respected doctor who had tried to help troubled patients overcome their psychological burdens. Miss Marple reflected on the terrible irony that had driven the killer to such desperate measures. Arthur Bantry had successfully maintained his false identity as Dr. Haydock for 25 years. He had established himself as a pillar of the community, trusted and respected by everyone who knew him. But that very success made him more vulnerable, not less. He had too much to lose to allow his carefully constructed life to crumble. The final confrontation. The most revealing moment came when Miss Marple described her final meeting with the imprisoned Dr. Haydock. "He asked me how I had seen through his deception when the police had accepted his carefully constructed evidence. I told him it was the tremor in his hands, the same nervous gesture that Hartwell had noted in his notebook, comparing it to the man in Bath who counted Mrs. Fortescue's jewelry." She continued with gentle inexorability. "But what truly convinced me was his reaction when Miss Pemberton mentioned seeing someone in the garden. He knew immediately that she had visited Hartwell, which meant he'd been watching the house closely enough to observe her arrival. An innocent physician wouldn't have possessed that knowledge. The psychological pressure of maintaining his false identity for so long had created hairline cracks in his composure that became visible under stress. 25 years of perfect deception, Miss Marple quoted from their conversation, undone by an old woman with knitting needles and an inconvenient attention to detail. Justice and resolution. As the formal proceedings concluded, Miss Marple reflected on the human cost of the deception that had finally been unraveled. Edmund Hartwell, whatever his original identity, had been the most honest person in the entire affair, a man hired to play a role who had performed it so faithfully that he'd lost track of his own true nature. His death had been the inevitable result of becoming inconvenient to someone who valued respectability above human life. The case had revealed how memory itself could be weaponized, how the most vulnerable members of society could be systematically manipulated by those in positions of trust and authority. Dr. Haydock had counted on the assumption that a confused witness would be dismissed as unreliable, never imagining that someone might look deeper into the causes of that confusion. Lady Ashbrook, humbled by the revelations about her unwitting role in financing Arthur Bantry's early schemes, had offered Miss Pemberton both a generous settlement and a permanent home at Ashbrook Hall, not as a servant, but as a companion in the truest sense. The gesture represented more than compensation. It was an acknowledgement that justice, though delayed by 25 years, could still transform lives for the better. As the participants dispersed into the gathering dusk, Miss Marple packed away her knitting with the satisfaction of a pattern completed. The butler who forgot every lie had finally received the justice he deserved, and the village could begin the slow process of healing from the discovery that evil could wear the most respectable of faces. The truth, like her careful stitches, had been revealed one thread at a time until the complete design stood exposed in all its terrible complexity. The mystery was solved, but Miss Marple knew that the lessons it taught about human nature, trust, and the vulnerability of memory would linger long after the formal proceedings had ended. In St. Mary Mead, as elsewhere, the greatest dangers often came not from obvious villains, but from those who had earned society's trust and used it as a weapon against the innocent. The trial of Arthur Bantry concluded in November with a verdict that surprised no one who had followed Miss Marple's methodical unraveling of 25 years of deception. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah Pemberton's patient documentation, the medical records, and Miss Marple's careful reconstruction of events left no room for doubt. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on charges of murder, attempted murder, and fraud. The village learns to trust again. St. Mary Mead absorbed the shock with characteristic English resilience, though the revelation that their trusted physician had been a criminal living under a stolen identity left subtle but lasting changes. A young Dr. Morrison arrived from London to take over the practice, his cheerful competence gradually restoring faith in medical professionals. Yet Miss Marple observed how people now scrutinized their medicine bottles more carefully and listened with new attention to explanations that once would have been accepted without question. Mrs. Price Ridley confessed that she could no longer take any medication without wondering what else it might contain, while the Reverend Clement found his congregation seeking guidance on how to reconcile their shock at being so thoroughly deceived. The realization that evil could wear such respectable faces, delivering babies, treating ailments, chairing parish councils, had shaken fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. One developed such an unfortunate suspicion of everyone, Mrs. Price Ridley lamented to Miss Marple, though Miss Marple suspected this was hardly a new development for the chronically suspicious woman. Restoration and justice. Sarah Pemberton's transformation proved the case's most satisfying resolution. No longer the nervous, fluttering companion, she had accepted Lady Ashbrook's offer to remain at the Hall as friend and equal, helping manage the estate. More importantly, Her father's name had been completely cleared in the London papers, his reputation restored after 25 years of undeserved disgrace. "For the first time in decades, I don't have to hide who I am," she told Miss Marple during a visit, wearing a smart new coat and carrying herself with quiet confidence. "Lady Ashbrook has been incredibly generous, but more than that, justice has finally been served." They had also located Edmund Hartwell's real family in Yorkshire, relatives who had believed him dead since the war. It emerged that he had been a struggling actor before his military service, which explained his convincing performance as the perfect butler. The irony was profound, an actor playing a butler, hired by a criminal playing a doctor, in a village where everyone watched everyone else, yet saw nothing beneath the surface. Mrs. Bantry had established a charitable fund in Hartwell's memory, supporting research into memory disorders and assistance for elderly servants vulnerable to exploitation. "He was a good butler despite everything," she reflected to Miss Marple. "And in the end, he died trying to do the right thing, trying to remember the truth that would expose a murderer." The philosophical legacy. As Autumn painted St. Mary Mead in gold and russet, Miss Marple often contemplated the case's deeper meanings. The butler who forgot every lie had been murdered not for his own deceptions, but for his knowledge of someone else's carefully constructed false life. His tragedy lay in being too competent at his role until the role became his identity, and his failing memory made him dangerous to someone who required absolute control over the past. The case had revealed how memory itself could be weaponized, how the most vulnerable members of society could be systematically manipulated by those in positions of trust. Dr. Haydock had counted on the assumption that a confused witness would be dismissed as unreliable, never imagining that someone might look deeper into the causes of that confusion. "The most dangerous secrets aren't those buried in the past," Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Bantry during one of their afternoon visits, "but those living actively in the present. Arthur Bantry didn't kill to protect his history. He killed to protect his current life as the respected village physician." Human nature endures. One evening, walking past the churchyard where Hartwell had been temporarily laid to rest before his journey north, Miss Marple paused in the gathering dusk. The shadows stretched long across the quiet graves, and she found herself murmuring, "Rest well. You remembered enough in the end, and because you remembered, the truth survived." As she returned to her cottage, Miss Marple reflected that St. Mary Mead would heal, as villages always did. New gossip would replace old scandals. Fresh mysteries would emerge from the endless complexity of human nature. People would gradually stop checking their medicine bottles quite so carefully, though perhaps they would never again trust quite so completely. Her knitting needles resumed their familiar rhythm as she settled into her chair, working on a christening shawl for the vicar's expected child, symbol of new life and fresh beginnings. The pattern emerged, stitch by careful stitch, just as truth had emerged from the tangled web of deception that had cost Edmund Hartwell his life. The case of the butler who forgot every lie was closed, but its lessons would endure in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, where an elderly woman with keen eyes and patient hands continued her eternal vigil against the darkness that sometimes hid behind the most ordinary of faces. Human nature, she knew, remained the greatest mystery of all, endlessly complex, occasionally terrible, but always, to the observant eye, ultimately knowable. Winter settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle thoroughness of fresh snow on ancient stones, softening the sharp edges of memory and laying a pristine blanket over a village still healing from the revelation that evil had walked among them in the most trusted of guises. From her cottage window, Miss Marple watched the transformation with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that communities, like her knitting patterns, required time and patience to work themselves back into proper order. The village learns to heal. The practical business of recovery had proceeded with characteristic English efficiency. At Greenways Manor, Mrs. Bantry had engaged Mr. Thornton as the new butler, whose references had been verified not once, but 3 times before his employment. The household staff, initially nervous about working under someone new, had gradually relaxed as they recognized genuine competence without the undercurrent of secrets that had characterized Hartwell's final months. One doesn't realize how tense an atmosphere becomes when someone is hiding something, Mrs. Bantry had confided during their weekly tea. The house feels lighter now, despite everything that happened. The blue room has been completely redecorated. I couldn't quite say why, but some spaces absorb too much darkness to remain unchanged. Young Dr. Morrison, settling into his practice with cheerful competence, had sought Miss Marple's advice on understanding the village's lingering unease about medical treatment. She had explained gently that trust, once broken, required patient rebuilding through consistent honesty and transparency. Mrs. Price Ridley still insisted on watching him measure out her tonic, but such caution would fade with time and genuine care. A nephew's literary curiosity. Miss Marple's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of her nephew, Raymond, who had come down from London ostensibly to check on his aunt, but largely to satisfy his curiosity about the case that had made headlines in the metropolitan papers. Settling by the fire with a glass of sherry, he regarded his aunt with the expression of a novelist trying to solve a particularly complex plot. "It is the theatricality of it that bothers me, Aunt Jane," Raymond observed. "The missing heir, the resurrected criminal, the butler with the secret diary. It feels less like real life and more like bad fiction. One expects a certain messiness in reality, not this tidy dovetailing of 25-year-old vendettas." Miss Marple smoothed the wool of the scarf she was knitting, a sensible gray for the new gardener, and smiled gently at her nephew's sophistication. "But Raymond, dear, life is often far more theatrical than fiction would dare to be. Fiction must be probable, you see, but life is under no such obligation. And as for messiness, I found the whole affair terribly messy. Poor Mr. Hartwell's mind was a clutter of fragmented truths that he could no longer keep tidy. That is the crux of it, isn't it?" Raymond leaned forward, his writer's instinct engaged. "The paradox of the butler who forgot every lie. Usually we think of memory loss as a stripping away of the self, but in this case, the amnesia stripped away the mask." "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking with familiar rhythm. Edmund Hartwell was a professional impostor whose entire existence at Greenways Manor was a performance. When the drugs began to dissolve his memory, he didn't just forget where he put the silver tureen. He forgot how to act the part of the man who didn't know anything. The lies were his script, Raymond. Without the script, he was left with only the raw, dangerous truth. The transformation of lives. She paused to consider Sarah Pemberton's remarkable transformation. No longer the nervous, fluttering companion, Sarah had accepted Lady Ashbrook's offer to remain at the Hall as friend and equal. During Miss Marple's recent visit, she had found Sarah working in the library with quiet confidence, cataloging the extensive collection with scholarly precision. "I've been thinking about writing an account of the case," Sarah had admitted. "Not for publication, but as a record. My father deserves to have the truth documented properly, and Edmund Hartwell's story should be told with compassion rather than sensationalism." The woman who had once faded into wallpaper now wore bright colors, red mostly, and spoke her mind at committee meetings. She had even taken up painting watercolors of the garden, quite successfully. It was as if, by exposing the truth, she had regained the substance of her own life. The deeper patterns. "You know, Raymond," Miss Marple said softly, gazing into the heart of the fire, "I have often observed that people are like knitting. If you drop a stitch at the beginning, the whole pattern unravels eventually, no matter how carefully you try to hide it in the later rows. Arthur Bantry dropped a stitch 25 years ago in Bath. He spent half a lifetime trying to knit over it, trying to force the pattern to hold. But the flaw was always there." She reflected on the curious thing about people who lived by deception. When they began to lose their memory, the lies were often the first things to go. Truth, she had observed, had roots that went down into the soil of one's being. Lies were like cut flowers in water. They looked quite charming, but they did not last. Poor Mr. Hartwell was simply the loose thread that, when pulled, undid it all, she continued. His tragedy lay not in being a criminal himself, but in being useful to criminals. When his failing memory made him unreliable, his usefulness ended, and with it, his life. The ongoing watch. The case had reinforced Miss Marple's long-held conviction that the most dangerous people were often those who appeared most respectable. Arthur Bantry's 25 years of successful deception demonstrated how effectively evil could hide behind professional competence and social standing, a sobering reminder that vigilance required looking beneath surfaces rather than accepting them at face value. As Christmas lights began appearing in cottage windows and the village prepared for its annual celebrations, Miss Marple resumed her customary position as St. Mary Mead's quiet observer. The case was closed, justice had been served, and life continued its eternal rhythm. But she knew that somewhere, in St. Mary Mead, or in villages just like it throughout England, other secrets waited to be discovered, other mysteries demanded solving. To the truth, then, Raymond said, raising his glass, however inconvenient. To the truth, Miss Marple murmured, picking up her needles once more. And to the memory of the man who had to forget everything before he could finally be known. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of the past in a blanket of white, leaving the village of St. Mary Mead silent, peaceful, and watchful under the winter stars. Her needles continued their steady work, creating order from chaos one stitch at a time, just as she had created truth from deception through careful observation and unwavering attention to detail. The butler who forgot every lie had found his final rest, his death having exposed a murderer and restored justice to those wronged 25 years earlier. Human nature remained endlessly complex, occasionally terrible, but always, to the patient and observant eye, ultimately comprehensible. And Miss Marple would be watching, ready to unravel the next mystery that disturbed the deceptive tranquility of village life. Spring arrived at St. Mary Mead with the gentle insistence of truth finally surfacing after a long winter of secrets. Miss Marple, working in her garden on a particularly fine April morning, reflected that both nature and human communities possessed an admirable capacity for renewal when given sufficient time to heal. The daffodils pushing through winter-hardened earth reminded her of how persistent truth could be, emerging despite every attempt to bury it. The village transformed. The anniversary of Edmund Hartwell's death had passed quietly, marked by a small memorial service in the churchyard, where he had been temporarily laid to rest. The gathering was modest. Mrs. Bantry, Sarah Pemberton, Lady Ashbrook, and Miss Marple. But the significance transcended the size of the assembly. Reverend Clement had spoken briefly about the complexity of human nature and the dangers of judging too quickly. Edmund Hartwell was neither saint nor villain, but a man caught in circumstances largely beyond his control. He tried, in his final confused days, to do what was right. Mrs. Bantry had transformed Greenway's Manor into something lighter and more welcoming. The shadows of the Blue Room finally banished through redecoration, and the simple expedient of opening windows that had remained closed too long. The new butler, Mr. Thornton, moved among his duties with professional competence that was soothing rather than suspicious. No trembling hands, no forgotten conversations, no hidden notebooks documenting the household's secrets. "It's almost boring, isn't it?" Mrs. Bantry had confided to Miss Marple during one of their weekly teas. "Thornton is so terribly efficient. I never realized how much energy we spent wondering what Edmund was thinking." Lives rebuilt and redeemed. Sarah Pemberton's transformation proved the case's most satisfying resolution. No longer the gray, invisible companion, she had accepted Lady Ashbrook's offer to remain at the Hall as friend and equal, managing the estate with scholarly precision. Her father's name had been completely cleared in the London papers, his reputation restored after 25 years of undeserved disgrace. She now wore bright colors, red mostly, and spoke her mind at committee meetings with quiet confidence. Lady Ashbrook, humbled by the revelations about her unwitting role in financing Arthur Bantry's schemes, had established a foundation supporting victims of financial fraud. The irony was not lost that her wealth, partially derived from questionable investments, would now help repair similar damage. Redemption, Miss Marple reflected, often took circuitous routes. Dr. Morrison had earned the village's trust through patient consistency, though the ease with which they had once accepted Dr. Haydock's pronouncements was gone forever. People now scrutinized their medicine bottles more carefully, demanded thorough references for new residents, and questioned authority with uncomfortable frequency. Trust, once broken, required patient rebuilding through transparent honesty. The deeper lessons learned. As afternoon settled over the village, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the case's enduring significance. The affair had demonstrated how thoroughly people could deceive themselves as well as others. Arthur Bantry had likely convinced himself that 25 years of respectable life as Dr. Haydock somehow balanced his crimes as a young, confident trickster. But moral accounting didn't work that way. One couldn't simply add virtue to cancel vice. The case had revealed memory itself as both weapon and weakness. Edmund Hartwell's failing mind had inadvertently exposed truths that perfect recall would have kept hidden forever. In losing his ability to maintain the performance, he had revealed the director behind the scenes. His desperate notebook entries, initially dismissed as confused rambling, had proven to be the most honest documentation in the entire affair. Miss Marple's continuing vigil, settling into her chair that evening with her knitting, a christening shawl in pale blue for the vicar's new daughter, Miss Marple allowed herself to contemplate human nature's infinite complexity. Each mystery provided fresh insights into motivation, deception, and moral compromise. The greatest service she could provide was simply to pay attention, to notice the small inconsistencies and nervous gestures that revealed deeper truths. Her needles clicked steadily in the gathering dusk, creating order from loose threads, pattern from formless wool. Each stitch represented a small truth, and together they formed a coherent whole, much like the investigation itself, where individual observations had gradually coalesced into undeniable conclusion. St. Mary Mead would continue its eternal rhythm of births and deaths, scandals and celebrations. New mysteries would emerge from the complex interactions of people living in close proximity, each carrying their private hopes, fears, and occasionally dangerous secrets. And Miss Marple would be watching, her mild blue eyes missing nothing, her knitting needles clicking their patient accompaniment to observation and deduction. The case was closed, but the watch continued, as it always would, until the final stitch was knitted and the pattern was complete. The butler who forgot every lie had found his peace, and justice had been served with the gentle persistence that characterized both good knitting and careful detection. Human nature remained endlessly fascinating, complex, occasionally terrible, but always, to the observant eye, ultimately comprehensible.